think if we can revise our understanding societally of trauma as a strength response, then we can peel away the shame that gets in the way of healing.
Yes. There is so much shame. Yeah.
So
and
much.
it's interesting because I mentioned this on some of my past podcasts that a few months ago I got triggered.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was the first time that I became completely aware of the beginning of the trauma when it first hit the intrusion part, which I want you to explain more, which is really interesting. All the way to the end when I realized that I was being triggered and I automatically wanted to do a self-sabotaging thing to myself, but instead had enough awareness to say, I'm going to do something different. And that's pretty much what you kind of describe in the article. So tell us about the intrusion symptoms.
Yes. So one of the okay, let's define trauma and then we can get to intrusion and then we can unpack how that works. So
yes,
because I think what I found when I first started researching trauma was that there's still a lot of debate about which kinds of events count as traumatic events and how do we define trauma. And so I like to start and make sure we're all on the same page.
Yes.
The definition that I use is it's almost like a formula. You have the potential for a chronic trauma if you have an event that produced unbearable emotions that lacked a relational home. So a lot of the times we have unbearable emotions, but we have a good support system and network to be able to process these things and put them away. When we don't, what is traumatic in the moment becomes lastingly so.
Yes.
And the central symptom, even though I guess the central umbrella of symptoms when you have chronic trauma is intrusion. And so this can come up in many different ways, but essentially because of the way that the traumatic memory gets filed away, it kind of in a problematic way for your brain, which I can explain in a second, your brain tries to give you opportunities over and over again to reorganize the memory file. And these come up in our day-to-day lives as intrusive thoughts. They can come up as nightmares. They can come out in repetitive behavior that we're not really conscious that we're repeating. So we'll sometimes repeat an entire dynamic from one relationship to another to kind of give ourselves the chance to, do differently, as you said a minute ago. And then the other thing is when things come up that trigger us. So essentially when something comes up in your periphery in some way, you experience some little fragment that is reminiscent of this disorganized memory file. And your brain recognizes that as danger and threat, and it sets off a set of stress responses. So to unpack the stress responses really quickly, this is the heart of the trauma response. We come to this earth as biological beings that have hardwired a set of emergency mechanisms. And these emergency mechanisms are the trauma response. They're designed to try to keep us alive in moments of incredible overwhelm and danger. And so this is typically, we talk about fight, flight, and freeze.
Right.
And these are the responses that kick in. They're there for a reason. They're adaptive. This is the part where you talked about how it's a strength response.
Yes.
We have these defenses so that when something is sufficiently overwhelming, we can sort of separate from the situation and keep ourselves alive. And so the trauma response at its root is a strength response, not a sign of weakness or disorder. The place where that gets really confusing is in the experience that you just talked about. When you get triggered, you're like, okay, crap, I'm feeling terrible. I'm having this really outsized emotional response to a situation that's not actually dangerous, and I can't seem to control it. So what do I do? And that gives us an idea of what typically needs to happen in trauma healing, which is that this memory needs to be integrated in such a way that you can be aware of it, as you said, and get enough distance from the response to be like, hold on, I'm having an overwhelming response. Here's why. Now here, I'm going to do something different.
Yeah. Cause that, and it was interesting because I was triggered when I was initially triggered. I was triggered in a place that wasn't safe, where I couldn't say what was going on.
Yeah.
But then a couple hours later, I was with my husband, and he definitely is one of my safe spaces for sure. He has seen, all sides of me. And I remember sitting in the car, and he allowed me to just say the crazy stuff that was in my head. Right. And I'm listening to this as it's coming out, and it's just it was crazy. And I just finally looked at him. I said, clearly I am being triggered. I am clearly being triggered because what is going on in my head and what's coming out of my mouth? There's no logical sense to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then to kind of top it off, like I said, my automatic response was to do something that would be self-sabotaging to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognized that. And I recognized how, I'll just say it for myself, but wacky I was thinking, because it really was. And I just looked at him and I said, I am clearly being triggered. We're not going to go do that crazy thing that I told you we're going to do. We're going to go do the smart thing. And so it was, I mean, for me, it was really helpful that my husband allowed me to just say it. Mm-hmm. And it was ugly and it made no sense. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, I felt so much better. But in the place where I wasn't safe, that was a little struggle to try to kind of manage that when I was in a place where I couldn't release that tension or whatever it is.
And actually what you're describing is actually like, it's almost a micro experience of a trauma. That's exactly what happens in the initial traumatic event, is that you can't process and file away what's happening in the way that you do with all the rest of your things. So if I'm like living my day-to-day life, I go to the grocery store, something funny happens. At the end of that experience, I get a very neatly organized file folder that I can pull out, refer to in language, and put away.
Right.
Fear brain doesn't have access to that file because it's so organized.
Right.
But when you have something that's incredibly overwhelming, your brain and body adapt really miraculously, again, to help you survive in that moment. But one of the things that gets shut down is that filing mechanism. And so you get a fragmented memory that can only be read by the fear part of your brain. Mm-hmm. So when you get triggered by something in your experience, in the moment, in the present moment, you are reliving the traumatic event.
Yes.
And so our behavior stops making sense to us. And this can feel really out of control because it's essentially the fear part of the brain, the amygdala and the limbic system, that are making decisions based on what they perceive to be mortal danger. And your rational brain is shut out of the conversation.
Totally.
And so there's something like neurobiologically, real that's happening there that we need to understand, because there's no need to be ashamed of that.
Right. And it was interesting because I know exactly what the trigger was. I know exactly what the memory was that it took me back to. Mm. And it absolutely felt like when I was a little girl and that situation happened. Mm. And that's exactly the way I felt at that moment. Mm. And it collided with common sense.
Yeah.
It totally collided.
Yeah.
But again, when it first hit me, I was in a place where I couldn't open up and just say what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. And it took me a little bit to kind of really push it aside and just go have a good time. And, I was with family. But it was still with me because as soon as my husband and I were alone, boom, it was right back there. And I needed it. I didn't realize it at the time. It looked back now and I see I needed to say it.
Yeah.
Because it is so true. I know when I worked with a lot of women healing from childhood abuse, that so many times when you say this stuff out loud, it loses its power, it loses its strength, and it loses its grip on you. And all of a sudden you're able to go, wait a minute, that makes no sense.
Right. And
it catches you.
And the neurobiology correlate to that is that when you're saying the thing out loud, you're manually putting your prefrontal cortex, which is like the rational mind, back into the conversation. So that's not just like people have said that forever, name it to tame it, but the neurobiology actually supports that. When you name something, you're bringing in the part of your brain that just got shut down. So it's almost like you're re-regulating the blood flow and electrical activity in your brain, which will make you feel calm.
That makes sense.
Super cool, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. And, and I found too, and I've heard this before, and I actually used it in this situation where you get triggered and there's a space between trigger and response.
Yeah.
But you have to catch that. And that's where self-awareness comes in. So you have to recognize, oh, okay, crazy stuff going on in my head. I'm clearly being triggered.
Yeah.
Take a breath, take a minute.
Yeah.
And if you are in a safe place, if you can say this stuff, like I said, my husband is just a safe place. He lets me say stuff, anything, and he doesn't judge me or criticize me. And it really worked. Mm-hmm. That really worked. That pause, the deep breath.
Yep.
The talking it out, and then immediately switching gears.
Yep. And I want to normalize for folks who are listening that often, especially in regards to a trauma trigger, there doesn't feel like there's ever going to be any space between the stimulus and the response, because there's a lot of work that has to get done to even connect the dots and recognize that this stimulus is causing this response. A lot of the time we don't even realize that. We just are
Yeah.
often running off to the races, feeling
Yes.
panicked or yelling or behaving or, fighting, flighting,
Yes.
or freezing. And so with work, that space can be created, and it doesn't take much for the whole experience to change. Because as you experienced, even being able to just step away for like a millisecond and recognize like, oh, my brain is going down a path it doesn't usually go down. What's going on here? Like, this doesn't feel like me. This behavior that I'm about to do maybe feels a little bit outsized for the situation. Hold on. Like, that's all it takes. And then the whole of your life can look different.